the same thing as all powerful, but they deny that. So that would mean there's a metaphysical composition in them.
Okay, because that isn't Allah's essence according to Muslims. And I don't. Let me be more precise as well with what I'm saying, because most Muslims don't know this, because we're talking about theology or what they would describe as kalam. Okay.
Yeah.
And most Muslims, the mundane, the normal day Muslims, have no idea about kalam.
Yeah.
The scholars themselves say, don't teach them or don't talk about the kalam because it will cause too much problems.
I know, but this is problematic, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you just say we don't want to talk about this, that just means we're not going to teach you guys this because we don't want you to leave the religion because there's problems entailed in this, right? And the problem is, if you say there's a real distinction between the attributes of God, then those attributes can't be identical to the whole of God. And if what a part is just something less than the whole, then it constitutes what it means to be a part to say that Allah has really distinct attributes. And that's the problem.
See, the problem I think the problem that we're having right here is, I'm not Muslim, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm just here to objectively look at what Muslims, what the theology teaches.
Yeah.
And I don't think the theology teaches that there's parts and wholes. I think there is one thing which is they call the that, which is the essence of Allah, and then there is something else called attributes.
So what I'm getting at, I'm not saying that their theology teaches this. I'm saying that this is the conclusion of their philosophy, right?
Okay.
So it's like a Muslim saying Christians believe in three gods. Obviously, we don't believe in three gods, but they're just trying to say that what you believe entails that there's three gods. Now, obviously, that's not true, but that's what they're trying to argue. What I'm trying to argue is that this set of beliefs leads to the belief that God is composed of parts, right? That's what I'm saying. And the fact of the matter is that Sunni theologians and scholars do teach that there's a real distinction between Allah's attributes, and that's all you need to be able to say this belief leads to God being made up of parts.
But this is not a specifically Muslim problem. Like, you have this internal debate within Christianity as well, like about divine simplicity, back and forth. Like,
And that's why divine simplicity is the way to go, man.
So
it's the way to
Shias
go.
would agree, right?
So
I mean, a lot of Shia Muslims, like the Ismailis.
Yeah, that's why they shouldn't be Sunnis. If they're going to be consistent, they should be Shias or Christians.
The Christian God, doesn't the Christian God have attributes?
Okay, so what we say about God is that he's identical to his attributes. So think about white light passing through a prism, right?
Yep.
White light is one single light. It's one single wavelength of light. It passes through the prism, and then you see multiple colors. This is in a way analogous to how we can think about God's attributes. So God is one simple substance, right? God is simple. There's no real distinction between his attributes for us. They're all identical to each other. But when we think about it in our human minds, there's a virtual distinction, meaning the way we think about it, there's going to be a difference between these attributes, but in reality, there's no difference there.
Greece is an Eastern Orthodox Christian.
So that's the position of divine simplicity. And that means that God has no parts. That's perfectly consistent.
For you, God has attributes, right? One, and those attributes are distinct.
No. Those attributes are only distinct virtually, but not
So
in
you're saying they're
actuality.
distinct for human comprehension, but not distinct for
Not
who he
distinct
is.
in reality.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do you differentiate that between the Muslims then?
Okay, because the Muslims, what they're saying is they're not just saying it's a virtual distinction between the attributes. They're saying it's a real distinction. Exactly. They're saying there's a real distinction between these attributes.
What's the difference? What's the virtual distinction and the real distinction?
Okay, so a real distinction is just that which maps onto extramental reality, right? So, for example, this finger is really distinct from this finger here, yeah? But a virtual distinction is just something that's only distinct in thought. It's only distinct in the way you think about it, but in actuality, it's the same thing.
Okay. So, but you're saying they're distinct virtually for Christians.
Yeah, only
but
virtual.
only reality. Yeah.
But in extramental reality, these attributes aren't distinct.
So are you telling me that God's attribute of being love, his attribute of love, is also the same as his attribute of a destroyer?
Well, we don't believe destroyer is really like an attribute of God. Like destruction could be described as like an effect from God's divine will of whatever he wills, but it's not like an attribute of God. We're saying that all these attributes are identical though. but it's just the way you think about it in your human mind. You're just going to comprehend them differently.
Okay, let me go there. So let me do a polarity real quickly. So you have God as a creator, and you have God as a destroyer. But you're saying that God as a destroyer doesn't exist.
Well, destruction is within God's creation, so it's the same thing. Like God, destruction isn't like an attribute of God. It's not what
If
we're saying.
God destroys, He now becomes a destroyer. That is an adjective. That is an attribute of Him.
Yeah, it's not
If
really.
God creates, He now becomes a creator, and He has a
God is a
creation.
Chinese
Isn't that the problem for the Muslims? How is Allah merciful before He?
Yeah, creator and destroyer isn't really like attributes of God. He has the like ability to create, but God didn't necessarily have to create. There could have been a possible world in which God didn't create anything.
Really, but how do you avoid like modal collapse? And
Oh, that's a good question.
Basically,
Okay.
sufficient explanations don't entail what they explain. That's
Yeah.
it.
Okay. So
Literally, that's it.
let's put forth a syllogism of the modal collapse. Okay. Premise 1: God exists of absolute necessity. Premise 1: God exists of absolute necessity. Premise 2: God is identical to His act of creation. Therefore, God's creation is of absolute necessity. Now, we're going to say this isn't in. Wait. Let me explain why it doesn't follow it. So we're going to agree with the first two premises as Thomas, but we're just going to say that this is an invalid argument. And the way that we can show this is an invalid argument is when we use other forms of the same argument, it leads to false conclusions. For example, if I were to say to you, premise 1, 8 is necessarily greater than 7. Premise 2, the number of planets in our solar system is identical to 8. Conclusion, therefore, the number of planets in our solar system is necessarily greater than 7. It doesn't follow, because there could have been 4 planets in the solar system. There could have been 5.
What's called something called rigid designation.
Yeah, so the argument is invalid. Okay, yeah.
Because the planets are not identical to the number 8. That's
Exactly.
where I would
So the point
argue.
is that necessity is not transitive.
But the problem is for the divine simplicity is if God's will is identical to God's essence, doesn't that mean that what God wills becomes necessary?
No, because necessity.
So there's going to be a distinction in God's divine act, like what things that He creates.
Is it a real distinction?
It's going to be a. No, it would be. I think it will be a real distinction. Look, God isn't. This is it. The reason why it doesn't work, and these modal collapse arguments has actually been completely debunked by a guy called Joe Schmidt. The reason is because God's divine act is not deterministic.
Yes, it's indeterminate.
It's indeterministic.
Is it necessary?
No. It's God's divine act. No, look. So it's true that God can be necessary and that God can create.
Isn't He identical to His act?
God is identical to His act.
Right, His
but
pure act.
His act is not deterministic.
But it would be necessary.
God-
No.
If it's identical to His essence.
What Christian? Are you Christian?
Yeah, but no.
Are you
God
EO?
God is identical
God to
to His
create.
act, but He can still act through.
I think he's probably an EO. I don't know.
It's not deterministic, it's indeterministic. So if it's indeterministic, it will entail a modal collapse. If it is deterministic, then it will.
Exactly. If God's divine act is
Also,
deterministic,
this.
then it would follow that the modal collapse.
Non-denominational.
Non-denominational.
But if
Yeah.
you say, if you hold that God's divine
Can I
act
just
is
say quickly?
Oh yeah. Go ahead.
I love you guys. You guys are literally like a breath of fresh air to Speaker's Corner. That's it. Listen, we
Thank
come from
you.
is, even though you're speaking religion, you're talking philosophy at the same time, and I'm loving that. Go on.
Yeah, I really want
perfect.
to understand, but to be honest, I'm not really catching all the things.
Basically, look, let's say I'm a necessary being.
Okay.
Now, it's going to be true that what I create would also be necessary in some sense that I created it. It's going to be
Your act of
necessary.
creation,
So
necessary.
it's going to be necessary that I created it, but it's being created. It would not be
Yeah, it's necessary by supposition, not by absolute
But it had
necessity.
to happen, right?
No. God didn't have to create anything.
Yeah, but let me
But
stop
the
and bring
act
some
is
controversy in there.
necessary.
Yeah, but the point is that God's divine act, that creative act, it doesn't obtain in all worlds. The point is that it's something called rigid designation.
If it's necessary, it should be known.
Something called rigid designation. When we have a sentence in English, typically what happens is that we designate an object as the privileged thing in a sentence. So when I say, God exists in at least some possible worlds. Well,
That's not the same God I believe in. I believe in
I know. I'm
just trying to use it.
When I say God exists in some possible worlds, what I'm saying, or if I say at least God exists in some possible worlds, what I'm saying is that what's being rigidly designated here is God. right? And not the possible worlds. So there are going to be some things that are going to remain true in some contexts of what is going to be rigidly designated, and it's going to be false in other contexts. For example, Superman. Superman has a secret identity. Sorry, Clark Kent has a secret identity called Superman, right? Superman and Clark Kent are the same person. But if I ask you the question, does Lois Lane know that Clark Kent can fly? She'll say no. But if I ask you the question, does Lois Lane know that Superman can fly? She'll say
But
yes.
they're identical.
So
Even though they are identical, the thing that's being rigidly designated is going to change.
So this is I have to just make some pauses here and there. Like so.
Okay.
So I feel like when you talked about God being like, if we're going to talk about God, we have to talk about something that exists in all possible worlds necessarily, right? So please,
don't take on that point. I wasn't saying that
so
God exists.
we're leaving that now.
Look, God is necessary and he exists in some possible worlds, he exists in all possible worlds.
Yeah, he's just using it as an example.
But what I'm trying to get you to understand is the reason why those modal collapse arguments don't work is that it presupposes that God's divine act is deterministic, and it's not. It doesn't have to be deterministic.
It's necessary.
God's divine act is necessary only because he has created. But he didn't have to create.
It's necessary by supposition. So if you read the Summa Theologia question 19, I think it's article 3, Aquinas will tell you that there's different ways in which things can be necessary. It can be absolutely necessary, nominally necessary, and necessary by supposition. He's saying that God's act of creation is necessary. Creation is necessary in this sense by supposition, which is basically just meaning to say, as long as God creates, creation is necessary, but it's suppositionally necessary. Similarly to if I sit down, I'm necessarily sat down by supposition, but I could stand up. That's the sense in which creation would be necessary, but it's not going to be absolutely necessary.
Okay, so
Does God's divine act have to create? No.
It doesn't. No.
but it's not an
simple as
act
that.
if it doesn't act, right?
That's the point. God's divine
does it need
act,
to create
it doesn't
to
have
be
to
actual?
create.
So are you saying the act can exist without acting?
So God is eternally the creator. Because God has one divine act.
So
And that
you
divine
have
act
to
was
explain to him
simultaneous
what act and potency is.
No, it's not act and potency.
No, it's not act and potency,
He
bro.
thinks act is like you have to.
No, there's no
It wouldn't be
potency in
act,
God.
there's no
bro.
potency.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
What we're saying is that look, this is the argument is trying to say that God's divine act, being identical to God, is necessary in what it creates. But that doesn't follow because the necessity operator is not transitive. It doesn't follow over. It's true that God is necessary, and that in him being identical to his divine act is necessary. But his divine act in creating things, that thing, the object that which it creates, is not deterministic.
Also,
it's indeterministic.
one small point I'd just like to add. Scholars like Chris Tomaszewski, Stephen Nems, people like this that defend divine simplicity against the modal collapse, have actually also offered an argument against theistic personalism, which leads them also to the modal collapse, right? So he parodies this argument. He calls this the tu quoque objection. So you could say God God necessarily exists. You would agree with this?
Yes.
God is.
I mean, I want to say that God transcends all our categories, including necessity.
Oh, okay, apophatically, God necessarily exists, though, right?
Well, I mean, if you're going to be strictly apophatic, then I'm not supposed to say, what God, like, I'm not. If I'm supposed to be strictly apophatic, I'm not supposed to say God is
we're just
necessary.
saying when we say God exists necessarily, we can just say.
But for the sake of the argument, I can grant God is necessary. Sure.
Okay. God necessarily exists. God is identical to the Creator. Therefore, necessarily there is a Creator. But you see how obviously that doesn't follow from that, because the form of argument is invalid.
So perhaps we could flip it around. So maybe you could try to show how God actually has free will then. Like, do you believe?
No, okay. So when we say that God has intentionality, we need to be very careful with this, okay? We don't mean God has intentionality in a univocal sense, but we mean it in an analogical sense. So for example, when we have intentionality, we have different brain states. We have different states in which our consciousness might change, right? We change because we're humans, but God does not change. So when we say God has intentionality, we're not going to univocally mean it in the same sense that we mean for humans like you and me. When we say God has intentionality, we're going to mean it in an analogical sense, which just means, in a sense, it's not univocal, nor is it equivocal. So for example, if I say the wine is good. George is a good man. There's a similarity between the way I'm using good, but it's also different, right? So we're using it in an analogical sense. And the way that we're saying God analogically has intentionality is this. God has the power to create. God created a possible world whilst he had the power to create alternative possible worlds. And in that sense, he has intentionality. Because I could ask you this, right? If I were to ask you, why does God create this world over another, right? We're eventually going to have to posit either some difference in the divine essence which makes him want to create another world over another, or we're going to have to deny something called the difference-making principle. And what the difference-making principle is it's just a principle that says whenever there's a difference in the effect, there necessarily must be a difference in the cause. And we're just going to deny that, and then divine simplicity just works under that model. But you guys would also have the same problem if you deny divine simplicity as well.
So I want to say that, I could be wrong about many things, but right now I want to say that God, most fundamentally, like I have to have a strict apophatic approach to what God is most fundamentally. So I'm not going to say God is...
But you can analogically predicate things.
I'm not going to say God is absolutely simple. I'm not going to say God is necessary. Because I do think, at least from what I understand, because I want to understand your perspective, but I don't understand everything. But from the way I see it, it does seem to lead some kind of necessitarianism if we kind of establish, like if we try to identify this is what the most fundamental principle is. It seems hard then to kind of make room for how everything that follows from this principle doesn't become as necessary as this first.
I don't think that follows, because I think the argument is invalid, and I think it relies on presuppositions that the classical theists could just deny it. And I would actually argue all theists should deny this principle if they're not going to be necessitarians. And that principle is the difference-making principle, which I mentioned to you earlier, right? If I were to say to you, why does God create one possible world over another, even as I'm getting Eastern Orthodox vibes, but you could be anything. So I'm just...
Sometimes I lean there. Sometimes I'm quite... I am generally interested in...
So
I look into Israel sometimes.
So if I were to ask you, as either EO or whatever sect you are, why does God create this world over another? What would your answer to that be?
It would be because of his truly free will decision.
Okay, but how does he have that free will? Because the point is, right...
How he has free will? Well,
so...
I'm kind of I know very little about how the Scotus. Perhaps I'm misrepresenting them, the Scotus totally, but from what I've heard, maybe you know more about Scotus, but wouldn't they say that there is a primacy of the will of God? So I'm kind of
Well, I'm not a Scotus, I'm a Thomist, but
I do think that there might be something irreducible to the will of God, that is going beyond the will of God. Might be unanswered.
I would affirm that God has a will, but what I'm going to say is that what we mean by God can freely create is just that God creates a possible world whilst he has the power to bring about another possible world, right? Because if we're going to say that there's a reason as to why God creates one world over another, that reason is going to be grounded within the essence of God, which would mean that we're going to have to posit that there are accidents in God's essence.
I think I might reject that principle. I think ultimately it would be grounded in the
energies.
Well, the most fundamental principle, which I have to have a strict apophatic approach to. So I cannot say it's an essence even. I cannot say
even as someone who apophatically, because also in our tradition, we hold to apophaticism, right? Okay. We hold to what's the saint the saint that holds to apophaticism a lot? Dionysius the Areopagite. Yeah. Okay. So even in our tradition, Saint Thomas Aquinas even quotes Dionysius the Areopagite, right? We hold to apophatic theology as well. But what we say is that we can predicate some things of God as long as it's in an analogical sense. Because I think even you would have to grant that, right? Because if we can only predicate things of God in an equivocal sense, then essentially everything we're saying about God is meaningless, right? There must be some likeness to what we're saying to what God is. Otherwise, it's just me saying blah, 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 right?
Well, the thing about language, the way I see it, is language, words we're using, it is essentially symbols and images. Yeah. And every word and every image, the meaning of it goes beyond itself. That's how it can be understood and recognized. It has a signifier beyond itself. And I think that's how we actually can say that we can know God without being able to fully describe him. We can even encounter and experience God, but still recognizing that when we try to even perhaps make sense of it using human language, there's going to be limitations to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a helpful and important principle to keep this negative theology. Kind of.
Yeah, for the record, I think apophatic theology is valid so long as we hold to analogical predication as well, right?
Okay.
So I think that you can describe things using something negative. For example, when we say God is immaterial, we're describing what God is by negating something about him, that he is material, right? Similarly to when I chip away at a statue, I'm revealing the form of what I want the statue to be by chipping away at it. But I also believe that there should be analogical predication there. Would you agree with that?
Like there's some of affirmations we can make. We have to qualify it, and I think then, like, am I making affirmations about what God is? God qua God, like God is in Himself.
Yeah.
Or am I saying what I affirm about symbolically? Because I mean, ultimately, language. I don't think language can escape its symbolic nature, basically.
Yeah. So
there's probably not a one-to-one correspondence.
I would say it's problematic if we can't say that we can analogically predicate things of God. I would agree. We can't univocally say anything about God. Okay.
But analogically, like an analogy is supposed to be a representation, right? Isn't it?
There's a certain likeness to
a symbolism.
Yeah, there's a certain likeness between God and what He's revealed to us, right? But He's not univocally like that, right? It's just analogically. Similarly to when I say the wine is good and George is a good man. When I'm using the term good there, it's not in the exact same sense, but nor is it in a completely different sense. It's I'm analogically predicating it of the two.
Yeah,
right?
I definitely want to, I also want to affirm, we can, as long as we recognize that the language we're using, it's images, representation, but in the Bible, God said, don't make images of we're forbidden to make images of God, and I think this is good to kind of recognize that.
Well, it says don't make any graven image, which is pointing towards idols, right?
Well, I mean, there's probably a different way to interpret it, but the way I interpret that is actually in a helpful sense, like when we actually get stuck in these kind of philosophical, circles and stuff. Like, I think what's ultimately going to help us to perhaps, it's like Wittgenstein's question, like how can we stop philosophy, right? And I think negative theology, apophatic theology, might be a good candidate for that. To actually, for someone who has a desire to be able to stop overthinking about God and be able to acknowledge that God is, God transcends our language and even our reasoning, and be fine with that.
Yeah. I think though that we can do this as Thomists as well, because even St. Thomas Aquinas from the Summa Theologiae quotes Dionysius the Areopagite. He affirms some apophatic theology, but what he just says is we can't univocally say anything about God, but we can analogically predicate things of Him. And my problem is if we can't say anything about God analogically, then we can't say anything about Him at all if it's just equivocal. That's my problem I'm having.
To be honest, I'm not the best read up on these different terms, like analogical and equivocal. But I think there have to be some kind of bridge.
Yeah,
I do
there's
acknowledge that something is communicated. But I think perhaps our deep understanding of some of these words might even happen in some kind of level that goes beyond words. Like, I think our being is, transcends language as well. I think, how can you, wouldn't you agree that, the fact that we have a conscious experience, the experience of the color red,
between two Christian brothers, right? Because
Okay,
I would still consider you a Christian, even though you take EED.
Well,
I'm sure you would probably still consider me one as a Thomist, right?
Well, I want to be open-minded about simplicity and EED. I don't have a definite.
Okay, so my problem with EED is I'm not going to call it polytheism, but I think it hinges on the line there. But it depends.
That's a
yeah. So let me ask you this:
how do we make them one?
Yeah. Does Saint Gregory Palamas hold that there's a real distinction between essence and energy?
So I'm far from an expert on. I've actually read quite a little from him. I mean, I did get his book, The Triads, have a look at it a little bit. But I'm probably not the best. I don't even know if I can make that definite decision. He said this, he said that.
Okay, yeah.
But I know he says things like, there's a famous quote where he says, God is beyond knowing and even unknowing.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know they have he was into that, what's it called, Hesychism, you know, where the kind of mystical Eastern Orthodox, where I think they do heavily emphasize negative theology and like God being beyond words.
Yeah, mysticism and that. Yeah, my problem is if there's a real distinction between God's essence and his energies, and these are uncreated energies, they don't depend on God. My problem is you now have two uncreated, necessary, independent things, which is essentially two gods in my view of how things go, which is why I want to avoid this essence energy distinction.
Perhaps, you know, I'm kind of like guessing, but I think the approach to the method in which they would say that thing might be based on negative theology. Like perhaps they're not making a positive affirmation that, you know, the essence of God is, you know, in relation to the energies. I mean, perhaps they would even deny that. Perhaps the way they reach to that conclusion is to actually say the essence of God is not like anything we can think of, including the energies of God. So it's perhaps that's.
But the point is though, we can know certain things about God's essence that he's revealed to us, and we can know certain things about his energies, which you guys say has been revealed to us through the saints and the church, etc. Now,
you know, when you say you guys, like I'm not.
Oh, sorry. You're not officially EO.
Like I'm like non-denominational, kind of looking at things, you know.
No, sorry. It's because I get a strong EO vibe.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay. Well, it's all right.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry, I meant even EOs, right? That's what I meant. So we can describe some things about God, right? Even under apophaticism, right?
Do you think there's nothing that escapes our language when it comes to God's being?
Nothing that can you explain?
Well, you said like there's at least something we can say about essence.
Yeah.
But isn't there something about God in which we can say absolutely nothing? Like that's what I kind of perhaps want to infer.
I'm not sure about that, because I think, you know, if it's intelligible, you can say something about it. But I mean, at least analogically speaking.
And I think that could, from my perspective, that would be fine. Like if it's not intelligible, but I'm saying perhaps we have to move away from, you know, intelligible reasoning and our cognitive reasoning.
I think we should stick to intelligibility, because, okay, here's my problem.
Perhaps God wants to free us from that.
Okay, so here's my problem. I have the same problem with the Muslims when they do this, right?
Okay.
It's called
we can use it as a tool, but we shouldn't be trapped in it.
Yeah, so when the Muslims do it, it's called tafweed, right?
Okay.
And I think sometimes some EOs do it. Not all EOs, but some EOs do it, right? So when I ask a Muslim, what does it mean that Allah descends? They're going to say, Allah descends in a way that befits His Majesty. We don't know how. Bila kayf, we don't know how, right? But essentially then, what descent means is it's a non-cognitive statement. There is no information that I've accessed when you've told me that God descends. So now if you tell me that God has energies, God has an essence, but you can't tell me like anything about God's energies, then essentially what you're saying is God has a blah, 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 right? It's unintelligible to understand.
Just on that point, like, but what if like God's descending is irreducible, like you cannot explain it in any other way, but however, the truth of that could still be communicated. For example, you know, if I ask you, like, explain to me the color red, like the truth of the color red, or like it has been communicated to you, you know what the color red is. But if perhaps let's say I'm colorblind and I ask you, like, what do you mean by the color red? You know, how couldn't I have the same critique?
Well, I could try and like scientifically explain red and stuff, but regardless of the point,
they wouldn't give me the knowledge of the color red, right? I mean,
but
what the experience.
The thing is though, when we're saying that like God has X, Y, and Z, and then when someone asks what is X, Y, and Z, and someone says X, Y, and Z is just what befits God's majesty, then essentially we're not saying anything about God when we say He has X, Y, and Z. We could, for example, change those terms out for any other term that you want to fit there, and it would have the same meaning because there's no meaning present.
But I'm saying it could be meaningful even if you cannot explain it in other terms, like the color red, for example. The experience of the color red. You can use scientific language like the what do you call the electrons or whatever, the photons hits your eyes, but that won't give you the understanding of the experience of color red. So if someone says God has revealed to me the experience of color red or something like that,
but I do think that
that?
but I do think that even in the EO tradition, you guys do make sorry, not you guys. I keep saying you guys.
I could be an EO for the sake
He
of
could be an
argument.
EO, but we don't know. I'm just saying that within that tradition, there are certain things that are said about God. For example, Palamas does say certain things about God.
Yeah.
For example, that God has these energies which are distinct from his essence. Whether it's a virtual distinction or a real distinction, I'll leave up to any viewers or whoever wants to look over this. But if it's a real distinction, my problem is I think that is dangerously on the verge of polytheism. If it's a virtual distinction, it's a bit more calm. But if it's a real one, then I have a big problem with that.
And I think the way I think the problem is framed, I think it rests on this binary system. Like either it's this or it's that. Like because to point out, like otherwise it would be a contradiction. And I think the response from the EO would probably be, well, God transcends those distinctions. And you could say it's contradictory. I mean, and they would say, well, God transcends.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they would say that though, because for example, people like Jay Dyer, he's a very popular EO guy.
To him,
yeah.
I think
he would say there's a real distinction between the essence and the energy.
Yeah, but I think I've also seen him heavily critique this kind of dialects that Western Christianity rests on. So I think they would also maintain that something like that, like God transcends our dialects and dichotomies. But would you be willing to affirm that God?
I would be willing to affirm that God does transcend us in some sense. Yes.
Even our understanding. Or?
In a univocal sense, God does transcend our understanding. Okay. But there's a likeness that we can understand God by. So we can just analogically predicate things of God in our tradition.
Yeah, but I think there's definitely things God can reveal to us or has revealed to us that we're supposed to understand. But I mean, to some extent, but we're not. I mean, what do we mean by understanding? Like I don't think understanding should be everything. Like I don't know, maybe it gets a bit deep, but
understanding isn't everything. But when we make a positive affirmation about something, and then we say, well, that's something we don't know what it means, then essentially we haven't really affirmed anything. We're just affirming a meaningless statement. That's my sort of problem with that, right?
Well, if I had an experience of God that I cannot make, like if I recognize that this is just transcends any of my vocabulary, anything like any of my knowledge, I cannot even describe what it is. But I still know my experience. I know I had an experience.
I do think there are things that as humans we can't comprehend, but there are things that we are able to like apprehend and describe in a certain sense, right?
Yeah, perhaps we agree more than we think.
Yeah, we probably do agree more than we think. After all, we're both Christians anyway.
Yeah, so I might have to get going, but it was
okay. No worries, man.
Action.
Okay, so this has been like a friendly conversation between a Thomist, someone that believes in divine simplicity, and someone that's a bit skeptical about it, with maybe some EO-leaning positions, maybe not. I'm not really sure.
Yeah,
you're looking into things, right?
Yeah.
Looking into things. That's good.
I could be wrong about many things. Yeah.
So we started off the conversation talking about the modal collapse argument against divine simplicity, which is basically, when we talk about modality, we're just talking about possible worlds and necessary things. And the modal collapse objection just basically says, if God is divinely simple, then God must necessarily create this possible world. Me, Rico, SY, we were debating against that point, and we said that modal collapse is actually an invalid argument because we can present other forms of the same argument which do not reach a valid conclusion, such as the planets analogy that was used earlier. So also the modal collapse argument relies on presuppositions, such as the difference-making principle that the classical theist can reject. And we also talked a little bit about the essence-energy distinctions and why I think I have a problem about that and why maybe you might not. And we also talked a bit about apophatic theology. It's been a good discussion, man.
Yeah.
It's been a good discussion.
Yeah.
So,
and,
yeah,
like, I don't know, I would probably say, like, at the moment I'm quite interested in negative theology, but I'll probably have to go home and read the Bible and see if Jesus endorses negative theology.
Well, look, if you really want to know a lot about the reasons why modal collapse arguments don't work, a guy called Joe Schmidt.
Yeah,
perfect guy.
What's Christopher Tomasz something?
Christopher Tomaszewski.
What's the other guy?
Stephen Nems?
I think Stephen Nems has actually denounced divine simplicity not long ago.
Has he denounced it now? Well, he has lots of papers against modal collapse. But anyway, guys, that's been your boy Thomas and your boy.
Martin. All right, see you.
All right, it's been a good one, man. Catch you in a bit.
Okay, brother, you want to promote your channel, anything, social media, Twitter?
I don't really have any social media right now. Maybe in the future, this summer, after exams, everything's been done, I might hop on the YouTube vibe. I might hop on there, so you'll be able to catch me on there. But all I got to say, guys, Thomistic metaphysics is based. All right, in a bit.